Welcome to Fear of Darkness. Today, we're telling the story of Malik Obadele, an enslaved boy, and a concealed truth that Mississippi attempted to bury permanently. This is a difficult narrative, one of immense power. So, take a moment, gather yourself, and listen closely. Before we proceed, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment sharing the city and country you're listening from. Your involvement ensures these stories remain in our collective memory and are not forgotten. Let's begin. The discovery happened in 2017. The photograph was found nestled inside a waterlogged trunk, which had been rescued from a torn-down schoolhouse in Natchez, Mississippi. Preservationists uncovered it, protected within waxed paper. Though faded, the image was still clear. A daguerreotype from 1852 depicting a young black boy around 12 years old, positioned next to a white man in formal attire. On the reverse side, written in delicate script, were the words, "The Negro boy who reads the stars. May God forgive us." This photograph was the property of a Mississippi judge named Cornelius Hammond. He had kept it concealed, and the reasons only became evident when researchers matched it with letters discovered in 3 separate archives throughout the South. According to plantation ledgers and court documents, the boy was recorded simply as Boy Malik in the files of Thornhill Plantation. However, that was not his full name. His complete name was Malik Obadele. He was 8 years old when he was brought to New Orleans in 1848, one of the final children to be sold through the city's slave markets before rising abolitionist pressure made such trades increasingly contentious. The events surrounding him constitute one of the most deliberately hidden stories in American history. It wasn't that the proof was misplaced, but rather that what he achieved was deemed too threatening to recognize. Malik didn't fight back with violence or attempts to flee. Instead, he resisted in a way the institution found far more menacing. He refused to let them strip away his education. Through this, he formed a secret network of literate enslaved people. This network would go on to chronicle the slave system from within, constructing a legal and moral case against it using the very tools of literacy and law that were meant to stay exclusively in white hands. The narrative you are about to hear has been purposefully kept out of history textbooks. The evidence was intentionally scattered across different archives. Witness testimonies were concealed in court files marked sealed. The story itself was considered so inflammatory that simply talking about it could lead to prosecution in several southern states during the 1850s. But pieces have endured. Legal depositions from trials that were held in absolute secrecy, letters from slaveholders who burned most of their correspondence but held on to a few pages that exposed their anxieties, and accounts from formerly enslaved individuals, recorded decades after freedom by researchers who knew that certain truths only live on through oral tradition, because official history chose to leave them out. When you piece these fragments together, they uncover something that Southern plantation owners understood, but could never openly confess. The most threatening slave was not the one who escaped or fought back, but the one who learned to read and write and then shared that knowledge with others. Malik Obadele was born in 1840 in Beaufort, North Carolina. His parents were enslaved on 2 different properties before being sold to a tobacco trader named Wesley Grant. Grant ran his business differently than most. He believed that select slaves could be made more valuable through some education, especially training in math and bookkeeping, to help run his commercial affairs. This wasn't kindness, it was pure capitalism. Grant noticed that his competitors hired white clerks who demanded wages and could quit or ask for better conditions. But enslaved workers with comparable skills cost only their upkeep and could never leave. The cost of their education paid for itself in just a few years. Malik's father, whose original African name was Aoun but was called Thomas in the records, had been instructed in arithmetic and basic reading to handle Grant's tobacco inventory. His mother, Yatund, who was renamed Sally, had learned to read proficiently for household accounts. Both understood that this learning was simply a more comfortable cage, not a path to freedom. Yet they also saw it as an opening. When Malik arrived, his parents made a pivotal choice that would influence everything. They would share everything they knew and more. They would raise him not to be a more useful slave, but to see the world with clarity, to survive it, and perhaps, in time, to confront it. The teaching started before Malik could even recall it. At night in the slave quarters, his mother sang him the alphabet. His father used dried beans to teach him counting, turning math into games that overseers never realized were lessons. By age 4, Malik could recognize simple words. By 6, he was reading newspapers his father brought from Grant's office, absorbing information that most enslaved children never even knew existed. But in 1847, Wesley Grant's tobacco venture collapsed. The reasons were complicated: shifting markets, bad weather, unwise investments. But the result was simple. Grant had to sell off his assets quickly, and people sold faster than land. In the spring of 1848, Grant's entire enslaved workforce was auctioned in Wilmington, North Carolina. The auction was thoroughly recorded because it became part of a legal dispute over Grant's bankruptcy. These files, kept in the North Carolina State Archives, reveal that Malik's family was purposely split up. Thomas was purchased by a cotton planter from Georgia for $950. Yatund was sold to a home in Virginia for $650, and Malik, listed as a healthy Negro boy age 8, some training in letters and numbers, went to a slave dealer named Josiah Brenner for $400. This separation was no accident. Auctioneers had learned that families sold together, sometimes tried to escape or take their own lives. Splitting them up, especially children pulled from parents, made them easier to manage, as their grief left them temporarily subdued. It was a calculated psychological tactic disguised as standard business. Malik's final memory of his parents was watching them get pulled in opposite directions while he stood frozen on the auction block, too stunned to weep. His mother called out his name, his true name, Malik. She had taught it to him in secret, telling him it meant king in Arabic, and that it came from ancestors who had been scholars before they were ever enslaved. His father stayed silent, his face blank in the way enslaved men learned to show nothing, even as everything inside them broke apart. Josiah Brenner was in what was known as the fancy trade, dealing specifically in young slaves who could be molded for domestic work or skilled trades. He bought children, knowing they would bring higher long-term profits, offering more years of work and the ability to be shaped to an owner's preferences before they developed firm personalities. Brenner's process was effective and brutal. He kept the children, all between 6 and 14, at a holding site in Wilmington for 2 to 3 weeks while gathering enough stock for transport to bigger markets. During this time, they were fed just enough to look healthy, taught basic obedience through punishment and reward, and systematically stripped of any habits that might lower their sale price. For Malik, the breaking process started on his second day. An overseer named Marcus Webb brought the new children together and laid out the rules by example. You will answer to whatever name you're given. You will speak only when spoken to. You will show no emotion except gratitude. You will never mention your previous families. When a 10-year-old boy started crying for his mother, Webb beat him until he was unconscious, right in front of everyone. When a girl of about 12 tried to comfort him, she was locked away for 3 days without food. The message was unmistakable. Any show of humanity or attachment to your past would be punished. Until you learned to completely suppress it. Malik watched these displays with the same focused attention his father had taught him to apply to everything. He noticed that Webb was methodical but not imaginative. He followed routines, applied rules consistently, and was predictable. He also saw that children who showed quick compliance got less attention, while those who resisted or showed emotion drew ongoing abuse. The path to survival was obvious: act broken while staying whole inside. So Malik obeyed instantly, spoke only when necessary, and kept his face neutral at all times. Within 3 days, the overseers ignored him, thinking he was already trained. But at night, in the locked dormitory, Malik started something that would shape his resistance for years to come. He began teaching the other kids. In whispers after the overseers left, Malik would lie on his mat and talk softly to those near him, passing on what his parents had taught him. The names they'd been given were not their true names. The families they remembered were real, even if they'd been taken away. The world was bigger than slavery, even if it controlled their lives right now. "My name is Malik," he would whisper. "What's yours? Your real name, not what they call you here." One by one, the children told him their names, their parents' names, where they came from, and Malik repeated each name back, making them promise to remember. They want us to forget. If we forget who we were, they win everything. If we remember, they only win our bodies. Our minds stay our own. This was remarkably complex thinking for an 8-year-old, and it came straight from what his parents had taught him. Literacy and learning were tools, but memory and identity were weapons no one could seize unless you gave them up. After 2 weeks in Brenner's facility, Malik and 17 other children were loaded into a wagon and taken to New Orleans. The 8-day journey moved slowly along muddy roads through Mississippi. The children were chained in pairs to stop escapes, given barely any food or water, and beaten if they made noise that might attract attention. Throughout this trip, Malik memorized everything: the route they followed, the names of towns they passed, the faces of every overseer, the exact words they used for commands. He was creating a mental map of the world, knowing that information itself had value, even if he didn't yet understand how he would use it. When they arrived in New Orleans in May 1848, the children were brought to a slave market on Chartres Street in the French Quarter. That building still exists, now a museum, but in 1848 it was one of the busiest human trafficking sites in North America. Thousands of enslaved people passed through its auctions every year, sold to buyers from all over the Deep South and beyond. The market ran with cold efficiency. Each person got a lot number, was examined by potential buyers, and sold to the highest bidder. The inspections were dehumanizing in ways often glossed over in history. Children were handled like livestock, their teeth checked, their bodies examined for any flaws that might lower the price. Malik was bought by a man named Cornelius Hammond for $550, a high sum for a child, reflecting his documented ability to read and do math. Hammond was a judge in Natchez, Mississippi, well regarded in his community and known for running an elegant household. He needed a personal servant who could help with paperwork, handle written communication, and provide the kind of skilled service that showed off his wealth and position. The sale record still exists, filed in the New Orleans Notarial Archives, sold to Cornelius Hammond of Natchez, Mississippi. One Negro boy approximately 8 years of age called Malik. Some education, healthy condition, $4,550 paid in full. What the document doesn't capture is what Malik was thinking as he stood on that platform, watching white men bid on his future. He was thinking about his mother's final words. shouted across the auction yard in North Carolina, "Remember who you are." He was thinking about his father's lesson. They can own your body, but your mind belongs to you, until you give it away. And he was thinking about something he'd realized in Brenner's facility, watching how the slave system worked. Its power came from keeping enslaved people isolated and uninformed. If they didn't know they could read, they wouldn't try. If they didn't know other slaves were resisting, they'd think resistance was impossible. If they didn't grasp how the system functioned, they couldn't use its weaknesses. But Malik knew how to read. He understood numbers. He had been raised by parents who were themselves educated, and he had spent 2 weeks teaching other enslaved children that memory and identity were acts of resistance. At 8 years old, standing on an auction block in New Orleans, Malik Obadele made a choice that would define the next 16 years of his life. He would absorb everything he could about how the slave system operated. And then he would share everything he learned with other enslaved people. Not dramatically, not with open rebellion that would get him killed, but patiently, methodically, creating a hidden network of literate, informed individuals who understood the system well enough to record it, remember it, and eventually speak out against it. The trip from New Orleans to Natchez took 3 days by steamboat. Malik traveled in the cargo hold with other newly bought slaves, all headed to different plantations along the Mississippi River. A guard named Silas watched them, making sure no one tried to jump overboard, a way some chose to escape into death when living escape seemed hopeless. During this journey, Malik did what would become his habit for the next decade, careful watching and gathering information. He observed the steamboat's operation, memorizing the crew's patterns. He listened to white passengers talking about politics, cotton prices, and how to manage slaves, and he spoke quietly with the other enslaved people in the hold, hearing their stories, telling them his name, asking them to remember his. When the steamboat reached Natchez, Cornelius Hammond was on the wharf with a carriage. This detail is recorded because Hammond kept careful notes on all his spending, including the cost of picking up his new property from the docks. In 1848, Natchez was one of the wealthiest cities in America. Built entirely on cotton and slave labor, the city sat on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, its grand homes displaying the immense profits pulled from enslaved people working the cotton fields that stretched for miles in every direction. Hammond's house was one of these mansions, a Greek Revival structure with white columns, manicured gardens, and quarters out back where a dozen enslaved people lived and worked to keep up the property and serve the Hammond family. Malik was introduced to the household by Hammond's wife, Eleanor. She prided herself on running a refined home. She looked Malik over carefully, making sure he was clean and presentable, then laid out his duties in terms that made clear she saw him as property needing proper care. You'll serve at table, run errands for the judge, and help with correspondence when needed. You'll sleep in the back room off the kitchen. You'll address all white people as sir or ma'am. You'll speak only when spoken to. Do you understand? Malik, sticking to the compliant approach he'd learned in Brenner's facility, nodded and said quietly, "Yes, ma'am, I understand." What Eleanor Hammond didn't realize was that Malik was also memorizing everything about the house, its layout, the daily schedules, where keys were kept, when people moved where. He was mapping his surroundings the way his father had taught him to map tobacco warehouses, gathering information that might later be useful. His first weeks in the Hammond household were spent learning his jobs and establishing himself as capable but ordinary. He served meals without dropping anything. He ran errands without getting lost. He helped Hammond with letters by reading addresses and taking them to the post office. From the Hammond's view, he was exactly what they'd paid for. A well-trained slave doing his work acceptably. But at night in the servants' quarters behind the main house, Malik began what he'd started in Brenner's facility. He started teaching. The Hammond household had 12 enslaved people. Most were adults who had spent their whole lives in slavery and had never learned to read or write. The youngest besides Malik was a girl named Grace, about 10, who worked in the kitchen. The oldest was a man named Joshua, maybe 40, who ran the stables and had been with the family for over 20 years. Malik's approach was slow and careful. He didn't announce he could read or that he planned to teach. Instead, while working alongside someone, he would casually mention something from the newspapers Hammond received. "I heard there's going to be an election soon. The papers say there's arguments about whether new territories should have slavery." Someone would inevitably ask how he knew, and Malik would explain quietly that he could read, that his parents had taught him before they were sold. The reaction was usually a mix of amazement and fear. Reading was illegal for slaves in Mississippi. Teaching a slave to read could bring heavy fines, and slaves caught with books or papers faced severe whipping. Everyone knew how dangerous literacy was, but Malik had learned from watching Brenner's operation that the best teaching came through invitation, not forced. So he never pushed. He would just mention what he'd read, wait for people to show interest, and then offer to teach them if they wanted. Grace was the first. She came to Malik after a week of hearing him talk about newspaper stories and asked directly, "Can you teach me to read?" Malik answered carefully, "It's dangerous. If we're caught, you'll be whipped. Maybe sold, maybe worse. Are you sure you want to risk that?" Grace, who had been born into slavery and watched her mother die from overwork 3 years earlier, looked at Malik with an expression that showed she had already calculated risks no child should have to consider. "I want to know things. I want to understand what white people know. Will you teach me?" The lesson started that night, whispered in the back corner of the kitchen, after the main house went dark. Malik used charcoal to draw letters on scraps of wood, teaching Grace the alphabet the way his mother had taught him. The sessions lasted maybe 15 minutes before the danger of discovery became too great. But they happened every night. Within a month, Grace knew all 26 letters. Within 2, she was reading simple words. Within 3, she was reading sentences from newspapers Malik brought from Hammond's study. But more importantly, Grace began teaching another enslaved girl named Hannah. And Hannah started teaching a boy named Samuel. The network grew, not because Malik was actively recruiting, but because literacy spread naturally once people knew it was possible. By the end of 1848, 6 months after Malik arrived at the Hammond house, 7 enslaved people in Natchez could read at basic levels. None of them showed off this skill. They did their jobs as expected, gave no sign of unusual knowledge, and kept their reading carefully hidden. But at night, in quiet moments, when white overseers weren't watching, they read whatever they could find: old newspapers, posted notices, bills of sale. They built their understanding of a world beyond what slave owners wanted them to know. This was when Malik began the next phase of his resistance: systematic recording. The idea came from something his father had told him. If you write something down, it becomes real in ways memory alone can't achieve. White people believe written documents over spoken words. If we want to prove what slavery does to us, we need evidence they can't dismiss. So Malik started writing. Not on paper that could be found and destroyed, but in places white people never looked. He wrote on the inside walls of the servants' quarters, with charcoal that could be wiped away, If inspectors came, he wrote on pieces of wood that could be hidden or thrown out. And most cleverly, he wrote in a notebook he made by stealing pages from Hammond's wastebasket, pages that had been used for rough drafts of legal documents and were meant to be burned. What he recorded was detailed and damning. Dates when enslaved people were punished and descriptions of those punishments. Records of families broken apart through sales. Documentation of sexual violence by white men against enslaved women. Lists of people worked to death and buried without ceremony. Everything the slave system wanted to keep hidden, Malik made visible through written records. He wasn't the only one doing this. He taught others who could read to document what they saw. Grace kept notes on injuries in the kitchen. Joshua recorded how horses were treated better than enslaved people. Samuel, who worked in Hammond's law office, copied legal documents showing how slavery was built on laws and property rights. They were creating an archive, hidden in pieces across the Hammond property, building evidence that could someday speak against the system that held them. This continued for 3 years without being discovered. From 1848 to 1851, Malik and his group expanded their literacy work and documentation while staying perfectly compliant in their assigned tasks. To the Hammonds and other white people in Natchez, these slaves looked exactly as they should be: obedient, somewhat intelligent, useful property. But then, in March 1851, something happened that would eventually expose everything and bring consequences no one expected. A white child named Benjamin, Cornelius Hammond's 7-year-old son, discovered Malik reading in the garden. It was a Sunday afternoon, a time when enslaved people usually got a few hours of rest. Malik had found a newspaper that blew into the garden and was reading an article about congressional debates over new territories. He was so focused he didn't hear Benjamin approach until the boy spoke. "You can read." Malik looked up, instantly calculating the danger. The boy's expression wasn't angry. It was curious, even impressed. But that didn't lessen the risk. A 7-year-old child couldn't be counted on to keep secrets, especially ones showing slaves breaking the law. Malik made a choice in that moment that would shape everything afterward. Instead of lying or making excuses, he told the truth, but framed it carefully. "Yes, Master Benjamin. My previous owner taught me so I could help with his accounts. Your father bought me because I have this skill. I use it to serve your family better." This was technically true. Wesley Grant had taught Malik's parents literacy for exactly that reason, and Hammond had bought Malik partly because of his documented education. But it was also strategically incomplete, leaving out the teaching network, the documentation, everything that would be truly dangerous if revealed. Benjamin, who had been taught by his father that exceptional slaves could sometimes be educated for practical purposes, accepted this explanation, but he was still curious. "Can you teach me things? Secret things that my tutors don't teach?" This was dangerous in a different way. If Malik taught Benjamin something inappropriate, or if the lessons were discovered, the consequences would be severe. But if he refused, Benjamin might tell his parents that Malik was reading without permission, which would lead to investigation. Malik chose the path that gave him most control. "I can teach you what I know, Master Benjamin, but it must be our secret. Your parents might not understand that you're learning from a slave, even though I'm only sharing what they already permitted me to know." Over the next several weeks, Malik gave careful lessons to Benjamin, teaching him advanced arithmetic and geography that the boy's tutors hadn't covered. The lessons were actually helpful for Benjamin. He learned genuinely useful information. But for Malik, they served a more important purpose. They gave him leverage. If anyone discovered the literacy network, Malik could reveal that he'd been teaching the judge's own son, which would embarrass Hammond and might make him protective of Malik to avoid public humiliation. But this strategy created its own risks. Benjamin, impressed by what Malik taught him, started telling other white children that his family's slave was smarter than their tutors. And in the summer of 1851, one of those children's parents reported this concerning information to a Methodist minister named Reverend William Thatcher, who made it his business to ensure that Natchez' slave population stayed properly controlled and that no dangerous literacy was spreading among them. Thatcher's investigation would eventually expose everything Malik had built and create a crisis, reaching the Mississippi state legislature, fundamentally changing how Southern states managed enslaved populations. Reverend William Thatcher was a complex figure in Natchez society, a genuinely devout Christian who believed simultaneously that slavery was divinely ordained and that Christian slaveholders had moral duties to give their slaves proper religious instruction. This combination led him to do regular missionary work among enslaved people, teaching Bible verses and basic Christian theology, while also reporting any signs of literacy or unauthorized education that might threaten social order. When Thatcher heard from a concerned parent that Judge Hammond's slave was reportedly teaching white children mathematics beyond their tutor's knowledge, he recognized this as potentially serious. Educated slaves were explicitly illegal in Mississippi, and if Hammond was knowingly keeping one, it could become a scandal damaging the judge's reputation and requiring prosecution to maintain the appearance of law enforcement. Thatcher's approach was methodical. Rather than confronting Hammond directly, who was, after all, a respected judge and church member, he began doing informal interviews with white families whose children had interacted with Benjamin. What he learned over several weeks troubled him deeply. Multiple white children confirmed that Benjamin had demonstrated knowledge, specifically in mathematics and geography, that seemed advanced for his age. When asked where he'd learned these things, Benjamin had mentioned Malik, our slave. The children's testimony was consistent and detailed enough that Thatcher couldn't dismiss it as childish imagination or exaggeration. In August 1851, Thatcher finally approached Cornelius Hammond directly, presenting his findings in a private meeting at Hammond's law office. The conversation was recorded in letters both men later wrote to associates, and these letters survived in separate archives before being connected by researchers in the 1990s. Thatcher's position was diplomatically stated but firm. "Brother Hammond, I bring this matter to your attention as a friend and fellow Christian. There are reports that your boy slave possesses literacy and mathematical knowledge beyond what is appropriate or legal. More concerning, there are suggestions he may be teaching these skills to others, including your own son. I trust you understand the serious implications if these reports prove accurate." Hammond's response revealed that he'd been partly aware of Malik's abilities, but had underestimated their extent, and certainly hadn't known about any teaching. "Reverend Thatcher, I bought the boy specifically because he'd been trained by his previous owner to help with accounts. I use him for running errands that require reading addresses and similar basic tasks. This is legal and proper. There are numerous precedents for slaves being taught specific skills needed for their duties. As for teaching my son, I was unaware of any such activity, but boys often exaggerate their interactions with servants. I'll investigate the matter personally." But Hammond's investigation revealed something far more extensive than he'd expected. When he questioned Malik directly, the boy admitted, because denying it was impossible at this point, that he could read at advanced levels and had been teaching Benjamin mathematics and geography. But Malik, following the strategy of partial truth, insisted this was the extent of it. He'd learned from his previous owner and had shared some knowledge with the judge's son at the boy's request. What Malik didn't reveal was the network of literate slaves in the household, the systematic documentation they'd been doing, or that literacy had spread beyond the Hammond property into the broader Natchez enslaved community. Hammond's position was difficult. If he punished Malik severely, he risked destroying valuable property, an educated slave who performed useful services. If he did nothing, he appeared to be violating Mississippi law and potentially facing social consequences. His solution was a middle path that he believed would satisfy everyone. He would restrict Malik's access to written materials, assign him to purely physical labor where reading wasn't needed, and ensure that Malik had no further contact with Benjamin or any other white children. This response satisfied Reverend Thatcher temporarily, but it created a new problem. Now that Malik's literacy was officially known and documented, other slaveholders in Natchez began wondering if their own enslaved people might have secretly acquired similar education. And this concern led to something that would expose the full extent of what Malik had created. In September 1851, several plantation owners in the Natchez area organized coordinated searches of slave quarters, looking for any evidence of prohibited literacy, hidden books, writing materials, letters, any indication that slaves were reading or writing without permission. The searches were brutal and thorough. Enslaved people's few possessions were torn apart. Living spaces were demolished looking for hidden compartments. Anyone suspected of literacy was interrogated, often under physical torture, to reveal where they'd learned and who had taught them. On a plantation about 5 miles from Natchez, owned by a man named Richard Calloway, searchers found what they were looking for. Hidden in a false bottom of a wooden chest, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were 17 pages of handwritten documentation describing punishments, family separations, and incidents of violence against enslaved people on Calloway's property. The handwriting was neat and educated, the dates were specific, and the content was damning. The documentation included this passage, which was later entered into court records. September 1850, Master Calloway sold Sarah and her 2 children to a trader from Louisiana, despite promising Sarah she could remain with her husband Peter if she worked without complaint. Sarah was dragged away screaming. Peter was whipped for crying. This is the 4th family Master Calloway has separated this year, despite his claims in church that he treats his slaves as Christian dependents. The writer wasn't identified by name, but the handwriting was analyzed by experts who confirmed it was written by someone with significant literacy training. And under torture, the enslaved person in whose possession the documents were found admitted that she'd learned to write from someone named Malik, who worked for Judge Hammond. When this information reached Hammond, he was forced to confront the full scope of what had been happening. His educated slave hadn't just been reading newspapers and helping with errands. Malik had created a literacy network that spanned multiple plantations, taught dozens of enslaved people to read and write, and organized a systematic documentation campaign creating written evidence against slaveholders throughout the region. The legal and social implications were staggering. If enslaved people could document their treatment with this level of detail and credibility, they created testimony that could potentially be used in court if laws ever changed. More immediately, if literate slaves could communicate across plantations through written messages, they could coordinate resistance in ways that illiterate populations couldn't. Cornelius Hammond's response to this revelation tells you everything about how seriously the situation was taken. He didn't just punish Malik or sell him. He initiated a legal prosecution that would become one of the most significant cases in antebellum Mississippi legal history. State of Mississippi versus the Negro Malik, charged with felonious teaching of literacy to slaves in violation of state law, conspiracy to undermine public order, and creation of seditious documentation. The trial began in November 1851 and lasted 3 weeks. It was conducted partially in secret because the testimony revealed details about the literacy network that authorities worried might inspire similar organizing in other areas. But enough documentation from the trial survived in sealed court records, in letters from attorneys involved in the case, in newspaper accounts that were published but later suppressed, that historians have been able to reconstruct what happened. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Malik had systematically violated Mississippi law by teaching literacy to enslaved people, had organized these literate slaves into a network that documented plantation conditions, and had created written evidence that could be used to damage slaveholders' reputations and property values. The evidence was extensive. Multiple enslaved people testified under duress and threat of punishment that Malik had taught them to read and write. The hidden documents were entered as evidence, demonstrating that the literacy was being used to create subversive records. And most damningly, examination of Malik himself demonstrated that he could read and write at levels that could only have been achieved through sustained education and practice. What made the trial extraordinary wasn't the prosecution's case, which was relatively conventional. What made it extraordinary was Malik's defense, conducted by a court-appointed attorney named Samuel Morrison, who was assigned to represent the slave because Mississippi law required minimal due process even in cases involving enslaved defendants. Morrison's defense strategy was remarkable for its time. Rather than arguing that Malik hadn't taught literacy, which was impossible to deny given the evidence, Morrison argued that the law prohibiting literacy training for slaves was itself problematic and possibly unconstitutional, though he framed this argument carefully to avoid directly challenging slaveholder authority. Morrison's written brief, preserved in the Mississippi State Archives, made several innovative arguments. First, he noted that Mississippi law permitted slaves to be taught specific skills needed for their duties. Malik had been purchased specifically for his literacy by Judge Hammond, who'd used him for tasks requiring reading and writing. Therefore, Malik's literacy itself wasn't illegal, only the teaching of it to others was. Second, Morrison argued that the prosecution couldn't prove that Malik had taught literacy intentionally, rather than slaves learning by observation. If enslaved people in Hammond's household had observed Malik reading and taught themselves the skill, Malik couldn't be held criminally responsible for their independent learning. Third, and this was the argument that caused the most controversy, Morrison suggested that educating slaves might actually make them more valuable property and better Christians, which aligned with slave owners' stated goals of civilizing and Christianizing their enslaved populations. This argument was deliberately provocative, forcing the prosecution to either admit that Christianity and civilization weren't actually goals or acknowledge that literacy might serve those purposes. The prosecution's response to these arguments revealed the fundamental contradiction at slavery's heart. They couldn't admit that literacy made slaves more valuable, because that would justify teaching it. They couldn't claim that slaves learned independently because that would admit slaves were intelligent enough to self-educate. And they couldn't argue that civilization and Christianity didn't require literacy without undercutting decades of moral justifications for slavery that relied on slaveholders' supposed duty to civilize and Christianize their enslaved populations. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Malik was convicted on all charges. The sentence was 40 lashes to be administered publicly, followed by immediate sale to a buyer from a state where he could be better controlled, specifically a cotton plantation in Louisiana known for its brutal conditions, where the expectation was that Malik would be worked to death within a few years. But before that sentence could be carried out, something unprecedented happened. Samuel Morrison filed an appeal that would reach the Mississippi Supreme Court, arguing that the trial had violated procedural requirements and that certain evidence had been improperly admitted. The appeal was a delaying tactic, buying time, but it also raised legal questions that the state's highest court felt obligated to address. During the appeal process, which took 6 months, Malik remained in jail in Natchez, and this created an unexpected opportunity. Jail gave him access to other prisoners, some of whom were literate free black people arrested on various charges. And in jail, away from plantation surveillance, Malik continued his teaching work, conducting literacy lessons with other black prisoners who'd never had opportunity to learn. The jailkeeper, a man named Martin Pierce, documented this activity in reports he filed with local authorities. These reports still exist and reveal Pierce's conflicted response to what he was witnessing. On one hand, he recognized that Malik was violating the very laws he'd been convicted of breaking. On the other hand, Pierce had observed that the literacy lessons made prisoners calmer, gave them purpose, and actually made jail management easier. Pierce's final report on the subject, written in March 1852, included this remarkable passage: "The Negro Malik continues teaching letters to other prisoners despite my repeated warnings that this activity is forbidden and dangerous. Yet I must report that his influence on jail order has been entirely positive. The prisoners attend his lessons with such focus that they cause no trouble during or after. I confess I am uncertain how to proceed, as stopping these lessons would likely result in worse behavior. Yet permitting them violates the spirit, if not the letter of my duties." This ambivalence was reflected in Pierce's actual behavior. He publicly ordered Malik to stop teaching, while privately ensuring that Malik had access to the Bible and other books that could be used for instruction, and failing to notice when literacy lessons occurred in quiet corners of the jail. By the time the Mississippi Supreme Court heard Malik's appeal in May 1852, the case had attracted attention from legal scholars, religious leaders, and political figures throughout the South. The central question, whether literacy for slaves served or threatened social order, had become a proxy for larger debates about slavery's future and sustainability. The Supreme Court's ruling, issued in June 1852, was a compromise that satisfied almost no one. The court upheld Malik's conviction, confirming that teaching literacy to slaves was illegal and properly punishable. But the court also ruled that procedural errors in the trial required a new hearing to determine appropriate sentencing, and mandated that this hearing consider whether Malik's education had been used for proper purposes of serving his master's legitimate needs versus seditious documentation and conspiracy. This technical ruling had significant practical impact. It meant Malik wouldn't be immediately sold to Louisiana. Instead, he would remain in Mississippi pending the new sentencing hearing, which was scheduled for September 1852. And during those 3 months between the Supreme Court ruling and the new hearing, public opinion began shifting in ways no one anticipated. The boy slave Malik Obadele, the hidden history America tried to erase forever. Part 2. The 3 months between June and September 1852 transformed Malik Obadele from an individual legal defendant into a symbol of larger conflicts about slavery, education, and social order that were tearing the nation apart. The transformation began with an unexpected source: Northern abolitionist newspapers. A Boston journalist named Frederick Walsh had been following the case through correspondence with legal observers in Mississippi. Walsh published a lengthy article in The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's influential abolitionist newspaper, describing Malik's story in detail. The article, titled "The Boy Who Would Not Stop Learning," presented Malik as evidence that enslaved people possessed intellectual capabilities equal to whites, and that slavery's prohibition on literacy was an admission that the system couldn't withstand educated examination of its practices. Walsh's article was republished in abolitionist papers throughout the North, reaching audiences in New York, Philadelphia, and other major cities. Within weeks, Malik's case was being discussed in churches, lecture halls, and political meetings as Northern abolitionists pointed to it as proof that slavery depended on enforced ignorance, and that slaveholders feared educated slaves because literacy exposed slavery's moral bankruptcy. The Southern response was predictable and furious. Newspapers in Mississippi, Louisiana, and other slave states published editorials condemning Northern interference in Southern legal matters and arguing that the case demonstrated why literacy for slaves needed to be more strictly prohibited, not questioned. But these defensive responses had an unintended effect. They brought even more attention to the case, making Malik's story nationally known. By August 1852, something remarkable had happened. Malik Obadele, a 12-year-old enslaved boy in a Mississippi jail, had become one of the most discussed figures in American political discourse. Abolitionists used his case to argue against slavery itself. Southern defenders used it to argue for stricter controls on slave education, and moderates in both regions struggled to reconcile their beliefs about human intelligence and potential with the reality that a child born into slavery could achieve literacy that reveled educated white adults. This national attention created pressure on Mississippi authorities to handle the sentencing hearing carefully. The state couldn't appear weak by being lenient, but it also couldn't appear barbaric by being excessively brutal when Northern newspapers were watching and documenting every development. Judge Cornelius Hammond, who still technically owned Malik as property, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His household had been the site where this literacy network developed. His own son had been taught by Malik, and his reputation, both legal and social, was now tied to how this case resolved. Hammond's private correspondence from this period, discovered in his family's papers in the 1970s, reveals a man experiencing genuine moral conflict. In a letter to his brother in Charleston, Hammond wrote, "I purchased this boy for his useful skills, never imagining the complications that would follow. He has broken laws I am sworn to uphold. Yet I cannot escape the observation that his intelligence and determination would be admirable qualities in a white child. The contradiction troubles me more than I can express in writing. What does it say about our system that we must prohibit education to maintain it?" But Hammond's personal doubts didn't translate into legal mercy. When the sentencing hearing convened in September 1852, Hammond had to maintain his judicial credibility by handling the case according to established law, regardless of his private misgivings. The sentencing hearing was conducted with unusual formality, partly because of the national attention, and partly because Mississippi authorities wanted to establish legal precedents that other states could follow when dealing with similar cases of slave literacy. The hearing was held in the Adams County Courthouse in Natchez, a Greek revival building that still stands today. The courtroom was packed with observers, local white residents, journalists from northern and southern newspapers, religious leaders, and legal scholars who recognized the case's significance. Malik was brought from jail in chains, a detail that several northern journalists noted in their reports as unnecessary cruelty given that he was 12 years old and posed no physical threat. But the chains weren't about preventing escape. They were about visual demonstration of authority and control. The prosecution presented testimony from plantation owners whose enslaved people had learned literacy through Malik's network. They described the documentation that had been found, the way literate slaves could communicate across plantations, and the potential for this literacy to enable coordinated resistance or escape attempts. Richard Calloway, whose plantation had been the site where the hidden documentation was found, gave particularly emotional testimony. This Negro's teaching has created written evidence of my private business affairs that could be used to damage my reputation and property values. He has taught slaves to document their experiences in ways that contradict my own records. If this practice spreads, every slaveholder in Mississippi will face potential testimony from their own property. The very foundation of our social order requires that such education be suppressed with maximum severity. But the hearing took an unexpected turn when Samuel Morrison, Malik's court-appointed attorney, called a witness that no one anticipated, Reverend William Thatcher, the Methodist minister whose investigation had initially exposed the literacy network. Morrison's questioning of Thatcher was carefully designed to create contradiction in the prosecution's case. Reverend Thatcher, you conduct missionary work among enslaved populations, teaching them Christian theology. Is this correct? Yes. It is my calling to bring Christian salvation to all souls, including those in bondage. And does effective Christian education not require literacy to read the Bible? Ideally, yes, though oral instruction can suffice when literacy is impractical or inappropriate. But you would agree that a slave who could read the Bible directly would have deeper understanding of Christian teaching. That is theologically accurate, though legally complicated. So, teaching slaves to read could serve the goal of Christian education that Southern society claims to value. Thatcher's answer revealed the fundamental contradiction Morrison was highlighting. In theory, literacy serves religious education. In practice, it creates dangers that outweigh those spiritual benefits. An educated slave is more likely to question his condition, to seek freedoms that God has not appointed for him in this life. Better that he receive oral Christian instruction and accept his earthly bondage while anticipating heavenly reward. Morrison pressed further. So you're testifying that keeping slaves ignorant is necessary to maintain slavery, even if that ignorance contradicts the Christian education that supposedly justifies slavery. The judge interrupted before Thatcher could answer, recognizing that Morrison was forcing testimony that would be quoted in abolitionist newspapers as admission that slavery depended on enforced ignorance. But the damage was done. The contradiction was now part of the public record. Morrison's closing argument was remarkable for its time, a careful balance between working within legal constraints while exposing moral problems. This court must decide what precedent to establish today. If we punish this boy with maximum severity for the crime of learning and teaching, we announce to the world that Southern civilization fears educated slaves. We confirm what Northern abolitionists claim, that slavery cannot withstand the light of literacy, that our system requires darkness to survive. Alternatively, we can acknowledge what everyone in this courtroom knows, but fears to say that this boy has demonstrated intelligence and determination that would be praised in a white child. That his desire for education reflects human capacity that exists regardless of race or legal status. That punishing him for learning reveals more about the weaknesses of our system than about any threat he poses. I am not arguing for his freedom. That is beyond this court's jurisdiction. I am not even arguing that what he did was legal. The law is clear that he violated it. I am arguing only that our response should reflect the complexity of what has occurred, not the crude reflexes of fear and control. The prosecution's rebuttal was delivered by District Attorney James Payton, who focused on maintaining social order rather than engaging with Morrison's moral arguments. Mr. Morrison asks us to show mercy because this slave is intelligent. I ask you to consider that intelligence makes him more dangerous, not less. An ignorant slave can perform labor. An educated slave can organize resistance, forge traveling passes, communicate with abolitionists, and document evidence against his masters. This boy has already demonstrated these dangers. He created a literacy network spanning multiple plantations. He taught others to document their experiences in writing. He established communication methods that could enable coordinated action. Mercy would signal that such behavior is tolerable. The only appropriate response is severity that prevents others from following his example. Judge Hammond's decision, issued after 2 hours of deliberation, attempted to balance these competing pressures. Malik was guilty and his crimes were serious. However, his young age, his previous training by a lawful owner, and the absence of violent intent justified some mitigation of punishment. The sentence would be 20 lashes rather than 40, to be administered privately rather than publicly. Following punishment, Malik would be sold outside Mississippi to an owner who would ensure he had no opportunity to teach others. The proceeds of sale would go to Judge Hammond as Malik's owner, minus court costs. Importantly, Hammond's ruling also established guidelines for how similar cases should be handled throughout Mississippi. Slave literacy that served legitimate masters' needs, bookkeeping, reading labels, following written instructions would be tolerated under strict supervision. Slave literacy that led to teaching others, documentation of plantation affairs, or any form of communication that could enable resistance would be prosecuted with full severity. The ruling satisfied almost no one. Abolitionists condemned the whipping and sale of a child for the crime of learning. Southern hardliners complained that 20 lashes was insufficient deterrent. But the ruling accomplished Hammond's primary goal. It created a legal framework that other courts could follow while ending his personal involvement in a case that had become politically toxic. The 20 lashes were administered on October 15, 1852, in the basement of the Adams County Jail. The location was chosen deliberately, private rather than public, to reduce abolitionist newspaper coverage, but witnessed by local authorities to ensure the punishment was properly documented. Martin Pierce, the jailkeeper, supervised the whipping. His report, filed with county authorities, was clinical in its description, but revealed discomfort with what he'd witnessed. The sentence was carried out as ordered. The Negro boy bore the punishment without crying out, which several witnesses found disturbing. One lash cut deep enough to require medical attention afterward. Boy remained conscious throughout. Demonstrated no fear or submission, which I report as unusual and potentially concerning regarding his future management. What Pierce's report didn't mention, but what other witnesses later described in private correspondence, was that between lashes, Malik recited something under his breath. Multiple people heard it, though none could identify the language. It was actually Wolof, the West African language his mother had taught him, passed down from her own African-born parents. He was reciting his family's lineage the same way his mother had screamed his real name across the auction yard in North Carolina 4 years earlier. Malik Obadele, son of Yatan Dinaun, grandson of Amara and Kofi, who were free before they were stolen. This act, maintaining his identity through remembered language, while being punished for literacy, demonstrated something that would become clear only later. Malik understood that the most powerful resistance wasn't physical, but psychological. They could whip his body, but as long as he maintained his mind and identity, he wasn't fully defeated. After the whipping, Malik was held in jail for 2 weeks, while Hammond arranged his sale. The buyer was a cotton plantation owner from western Louisiana named Vincent Thibault, who ran a massive operation near Shreveport with over 300 enslaved workers. Thibault had a reputation for harsh discipline and high productivity, exactly the kind of place where authorities hoped Malik's influence would be minimized. The sale was finalized on November 1st, 1852, for $380, less than Hammond had paid 4 years earlier, reflecting Malik's now documented history of seditious education that reduced his value. The sale document included special conditions. Buyer acknowledges slaves' literacy and agrees to prohibit any access to written materials, any contact with other slaves capable of learning, and any duties requiring reading or writing. Slave to be employed exclusively in field labor under direct supervision. These conditions essentially meant that Malik was being sent to a place where his education would be rendered useless, and where he would be isolated from anyone he might teach. It was intellectual imprisonment added to physical enslavement. The transport to Louisiana took 8 days, moving along muddy roads through swamps and pine forests. Malik was chained in a coffle with 7 other slaves Thibault had purchased in Mississippi. The journey was supervised by a professional slave trader named Marcus Webb, the same man who'd run Josiah Brenner's breaking facility 4 years earlier. Webb recognized Malik immediately, though he said nothing until the 3rd night of the journey, when they stopped at a camp. Then he spoke quietly, making sure the other slaves and Thibault's overseer couldn't hear. "I remember you. You were 8 years old, already smarter than most grown men. I watched you in Brenner's facility. Saw how you observed everything. How you taught the other children to remember their names. I knew then you'd cause trouble someday." Malik, whose back still hurt from the whipping, looked at Webb with the same direct eye contact that had disturbed overseers years earlier. "I don't cause trouble. I teach people to think. That's only trouble to people who profit from others not thinking." Webb's response was unexpected. "You're right, and that's why you'll probably die young on Thibault's plantation. Men like him break like the smart ones first because they're most dangerous. But I'll tell you something. I've been in this business 30 years, and I've never seen a slave do what you did, create a whole network of literate slaves right under everyone's nose. That took intelligence and courage that most white men don't have. It won't save you, but it's worth acknowledging." This strange moment of recognition from someone who dedicated his life to the slave trade revealed something important. Even people complicit in slavery's machinery could recognize extraordinary resistance when they witnessed it, even if that recognition changed nothing about their behavior. Vincent Thibault's plantation was one of the largest cotton operations in Louisiana. Approximately 8,000 acres worked by over 300 enslaved people organized into labor gangs, supervised by multiple overseers. The scale was industrial. This wasn't farming in any traditional sense. It was mechanized extraction of profit from human labor, calibrated to maximize output while minimizing maintenance costs. Malik's arrival was documented in Thibault's ledgers, which still exist in Louisiana State University's archives. November 9, 1852, received Negro boy Malik from Mississippi, age 12, assigned to children's gang picking cotton, documented literacy, strictly prohibited from any reading, writing, special watch required. The children's gang consisted of enslaved workers between ages 8 and 14 who picked cotton under supervision of an overseer named Jack Slave. The work was brutal for children, 10 to 12 hours daily during harvest season, bent over in fields, hands bleeding from cotton bolls, backs aching from the constant stooping and lifting. The daily quota was 40 pounds of picked cotton per child, enforced through beatings for anyone who failed to meet it. Malik adapted to this regime, the same way he'd adapted to every previous situation. Through careful observation and strategic compliance, he met his quota, caused no obvious trouble, and seemed to accept his degradation from educated house servant to field hand. But he was actually doing what he'd always done, watching, learning, and planning. The plantation had a different structure than the smaller operations Malik had experienced. With 300 enslaved people, there were complex social networks, hierarchies, and communication systems that white overseers never fully understood. There were drivers, enslaved men given supervisory authority over work gangs, required to enforce quotas, but often finding ways to protect people under their supervision. There were skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, who had slightly better conditions and more mobility around the plantation. And there were field workers, the majority of the enslaved population, who did the hardest labor under the worst conditions. Malik recognized that this scale created opportunities that smaller plantations didn't offer. With 300 people, it was impossible for overseers to monitor everyone constantly. Information could spread through work gangs across fields into different parts of the plantation without white supervision detecting it. The very size that made the operation profitable also made it harder to control completely. He spent his first 3 months simply observing and surviving, learning the plantation's rhythms, identifying who had influence in different groups, understanding which overseers were cruel versus merely harsh, mapping the geography and routines. He was building a mental model of the system, looking for spaces where resistance could operate. The opportunity came in February 1853, during a Sunday rest period when enslaved people were given a few hours for their own activities. Malik had been assigned to share a cabin with 5 other boys from the children's gang. One of them, a 14-year-old named Isaac, who'd been born on the plantation, had been watching Malik carefully for weeks. Finally, Isaac spoke directly. "The others say you can read. They say you taught slaves in Mississippi before they sent you here. That true?" Malik had to decide quickly whether Isaac was genuinely curious or testing him on behalf of overseers. He chose to trust his observation that Isaac had been protecting younger children in the work gang, taking extra beatings to shield others from punishment. "It's true. But they sent me here specifically because they don't want me teaching anymore. If I'm caught doing it again, the punishment will be worse than whipping." Isaac's response revealed why he'd been observing Malik. "There's others here who want to learn. Not many. Most folks too scared, too tired. But some of us think maybe reading could help us someday. Even if we can't use it now, maybe our children could. Or maybe when things change, like some folks say might happen eventually." This was the opening Malik had been watching for. Someone willing to take risks for knowledge, understanding that education was an investment in future possibilities, even when present circumstances were hopeless. "How many others?" Malik asked. "Maybe 10. All young, all born here, so they speak English good. All smart enough to understand this could get us killed, but wanting to try anyway." Malik made the calculation he'd been making since he was 8 years old in Brenner's facility. The risk of doing nothing versus the risk of resistance. Doing nothing meant accepting intellectual death, along with physical slavery. Resistance meant danger, but also meant maintaining the work his parents had started when they taught him, continuing the network that had been suppressed in Mississippi. Tell the others this. I'll teach anyone who genuinely wants to learn. But it has to be done carefully, in small groups, with everyone understanding the dangers. And the first rule is that we teach each other. I show you how to read, you teach someone else. That way, if they sell me or kill me, the knowledge survives. Over the next 6 months, Malik rebuilt what he'd created in Mississippi, a network of enslaved people teaching each other literacy while performing their assigned duties, without raising suspicion. The scale was different here. In Hammond's household in Natchez, he taught 7 people. On Thibault's plantation, with 300 enslaved people and multiple overseers who couldn't monitor everyone constantly, the network eventually included 40 people. The teaching methods had to adapt to the different environment. In Natchez, lessons happened in servants' quarters, at night with some privacy. On the plantation, lessons happened in fragments, a few minutes during water breaks in the fields, whispered instruction while working side by side, symbols scratched in dirt and immediately erased. It was slower, more dangerous, and required incredible discipline from everyone involved, but it worked. By August 1853, 40 enslaved people on Thibault's plantation could read at basic levels. 10 could write, and most importantly, they were teaching each other, rather than depending solely on Malik, which meant the network could survive his removal. The documentation practice also resumed, adapted to plantation conditions. Writing materials were scarce, so they documented orally, memorizing names, dates, and incidents the way Malik's mother had taught him to memorize his family lineage. They created spoken records that multiple people memorized, ensuring that if some were sold or died, others would carry the knowledge forward. What they documented was systematic and damning. Specific instances of violence, sexual assault, family separations, and deaths from overwork. They recorded which overseers were cruelest, which drivers could be trusted to protect field workers, which white visitors to the plantation expressed discomfort with conditions. They were building testimony, preparing evidence for a future that they couldn't see clearly, but hoped might come eventually. Vincent Thibault had no idea any of this was happening. His plantation continued operating profitably. His enslaved workers met their quotas and showed no signs of organized resistance. From his perspective, the system was functioning exactly as designed. But in reality, 40 people on his plantation were no longer the ignorant laborers the slave system required. They could read. They could write. They understood that their enslavement was criminal rather than natural. And they were teaching others, spreading literacy through networks that existed completely outside white supervision. This continued undetected until March 1854, when something happened that would expose everything and create consequences that reached far beyond one Louisiana plantation. The incident began with a visiting merchant named Daniel Crawford, who came to Thibault's plantation to purchase cotton for shipment to New Orleans. Crawford brought his 15-year-old son, Robert, along to teach him about the family business, and Robert, bored during negotiations between the adults, wandered into the fields where enslaved children were working. Robert encountered Malik and several other boys from the children's gang. During a brief rest period, the white teenager, curious about slave life and confident in his racial superiority, began asking questions about their experiences. One of the boys, emboldened by literacy and by Malik's teaching about resistance, did something unprecedented. He challenged Robert's assumptions. When Robert casually mentioned that slaves should be grateful for masters who provided food and shelter, the boy, whose name was Samuel, responded with an argument that revealed education. "You say we should be grateful for food and shelter, but we grow the food in your fields and build the shelter with our hands. We are giving you labor worth far more than the minimal food and poor shelter you provide. The mathematics don't justify your claim." Robert was shocked that a slave child could construct such an argument using terms like mathematics and justify. He reported this conversation to his father, who immediately reported it to Thibault, and Thibault recognized this as indicating exactly what he'd been warned about when purchasing Malik. Literacy was spreading despite prohibitions. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal. Thibault brought in professional interrogators, men who specialized in extracting information from enslaved people through torture. Over 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved workers were questioned, beaten, and terrorized into revealing what they knew. The network's scale became apparent quickly. Interrogators discovered that 40 people could read, that they'd been documenting plantation conditions, that the entire operation had been organized by the boy from Mississippi, who'd been purchased specifically with warnings about his dangerous education. Thibault's response revealed how seriously this was taken. He didn't just punish the individuals involved. He initiated what amounted to a purge, systematically selling every enslaved person identified as literate, even if that meant losing valuable workers and disrupting his labor force. He would rather accept financial losses than allow educated slaves to remain on his property. The sales were conducted hastily through a slave trader named Harrison Webb, no relation to Marcus Webb, who specialized in problematic slaves that needed to be moved quickly. Over a 2-week period in April 1854, 40 enslaved people were removed from Thibault's plantation and sold to various buyers across the Deep South, deliberately separated to prevent them from reconstituting their network. Malik himself was sold to a buyer from Texas, a rancher named William Garrett, who needed workers for cattle operations in the remote western part of the state, where supervision would be tight and opportunities for teaching would be minimal. But before these sales were finalized, something unprecedented occurred that would make Malik's story nationally significant once again. One of the enslaved men being sold, a 30-year-old field worker named Benjamin, who'd learned to write through Malik's teaching, managed to smuggle out a letter. The letter was carried by a free black riverboat worker to New Orleans, where it was delivered to a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Thomas Alcott, who was known to have abolitionist sympathies. The letter, written in surprisingly sophisticated English, described the literacy network, the documentation of plantation conditions, and the brutal suppression following its discovery. The letter ended with this passage: "We are 40 people who learn to read and write despite laws meant to keep us ignorant. We are being sold and separated to punish us for learning. But we want the world to know that we existed, that we were conscious and intelligent, that we documented what was done to us. Someday someone will testify to these truths. This letter is proof that we preserved evidence they cannot destroy." Reverend Alcott recognized the letter's significance immediately. He made copies and sent them to abolitionist newspapers in the North, to anti-slavery politicians, and to religious organizations that opposed slavery. Within weeks, the letter was being published in newspapers across the North, presented as evidence that enslaved people possessed full intellectual capabilities and that slavery depended on brutal suppression of education. The Southern response was predictable fury. Louisiana newspapers condemned Northern interference, claimed the letter was a forgery created by abolitionists, and argued that the incident proved why slave literacy needed to be even more strictly controlled. But the letter's publication had consequences that went beyond political arguments. It brought renewed national attention to Malik Obadele, now 14 years old and being sold for the third time, who had created two separate literacy networks in two different states, despite systematic attempts to prevent him from teaching. And it sparked something that no one anticipated. Other enslaved people who'd been taught to read and write, either by Malik or by people he'd trained, began finding ways to send their own letters and testimony to Northern allies. Over the following months, additional documentation emerged: letters, statements, testimony, all describing literacy networks, documentation of plantation conditions, and systematic evidence of slavery's brutality. The archives of several abolitionist organizations, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, contain collections of these letters smuggled out of the South between 1854 and 1856. Historians who've studied them found consistent patterns suggesting coordination. The writers had been trained using similar methods, employed comparable documentation techniques, and were consciously building a case against slavery through accumulated testimony. This documentation campaign was Malik's most significant achievement, though he wasn't personally responsible for most of it. He'd created a methodology, teaching literacy, training people to document their experiences, establishing networks that could survive his absence, that others adopted and spread far beyond his direct influence. By 1856, Southern authorities across multiple states recognized they faced something unprecedented: a distributed network of literate slaves, creating written evidence about slavery from inside the system. And the response was legislative action designed specifically to prevent what Malik had pioneered. Between 1854 and 1857, 6 Southern states passed new laws or strengthened existing ones regarding slave literacy. These laws were remarkably similar, suggesting coordination between state governments. Mississippi's 1854 law increased penalties for teaching slaves to read or write, made it illegal for slaves to possess written materials of any kind, including religious texts, and mandated that plantation owners conduct monthly searches of slave quarters to ensure no prohibited literacy or documentation existed. Louisiana's 1855 law went further, criminalizing not just teaching literacy, but also permitting slaves to acquire literacy through neglect of proper supervision. This meant that slaveholders could be prosecuted if their enslaved people learned to read, even if the owner hadn't explicitly taught them. Alabama's 1856 law prohibited free black people from teaching literacy to anyone, enslaved or free, effectively making black education illegal throughout the state. Georgia's 1856 law required that any slave found with written materials be whipped and sold outside the state, with proceeds going to the state rather than the owner, eliminating any financial incentive for owners to protect literate slaves. South Carolina's 1857 law mandated prison sentences for white people caught teaching literacy to slaves and established rewards for informants who reported illegal education. Texas, where Malik had been sold in 1854, passed comprehensive legislation in 1857 that essentially criminalized every aspect of slave literacy: teaching it, learning it, practicing it, or possessing materials that could be used for it. These laws collectively represented the most aggressive anti-literacy campaign in American history. They demonstrated that Southern authorities understood literacy was genuinely dangerous, not because literate slaves were more likely to violently rebel, but because literacy enabled documentation, communication, and the creation of testimony that undermined slavery's moral and legal foundations. But laws couldn't erase what Malik had already created. The literacy networks continued operating covertly, adapting to increased surveillance. People who'd learned to read taught others carefully. Documentation continued through oral preservation when written records became too dangerous, and the testimony that had been collected found its way to northern abolitionists who preserved it for eventual use. Malik himself, now working on William Garrett's ranch in western Texas, continued teaching despite the dangers. The ranch environment was different from plantation agriculture. Enslaved workers handled cattle, maintained equipment, and worked in smaller groups with less direct supervision. This created opportunities for teaching during long days riding range or working in distant pastures away from overseer surveillance. By 1858, approximately 15 enslaved workers on Garrett's ranch could read. They created a small library hidden in an unused line shack, books and newspapers that Malik smuggled from the ranch house, religious texts that free black cowboys brought from town, abolition pamphlets that somehow circulated through networks no white people fully understood. This continued until August 1859, when a white ranch hand discovered the hidden library and reported it to Garrett. The response was immediate and severe. All 15 literate slaves were whipped and sold. The books were burned. And Malik, now 19 years old and considered incorrigibly committed to illegal education, was sold once more, this time to a buyer specifically seeking slaves too dangerous for normal plantation work. The buyer was a man named Josiah Crawford, who operated a turpentine camp in the pine forests of southern Georgia. Turpentine camps were among the most brutal operations in the slave South. Isolated forest camps where enslaved workers tapped pine trees for resin under conditions that killed people at horrifying rates. Life expectancy for slaves in turpentine camps averaged 5 years. The work was poisonous. The isolation was complete, and the management was deliberately harsh because turpentine operators could purchase problematic slaves at discounted prices and work them to death without social scrutiny. Malik arrived at Crawford's turpentine camp in September 1859. He was 19 years old and had been enslaved for 19 years. He'd been sold 5 times, whipped twice, taught hundreds of people to read, created multiple literacy networks, inspired documentation that reached northern abolitionists, and prompted legislative changes across 6 states. And he was about to spend the last phase of his enslaved life in conditions designed to break anyone who'd survived everything else. The turpentine camp was located deep in Georgia's pine forests, accessible only by rough roads that turned impassable in heavy rain. Approximately 60 enslaved workers lived there permanently, working under supervision of an overseer named Jacob Stone, who ran the operation with minimal interference from Crawford, who visited only quarterly to collect profits. The work itself was brutal and toxic. Slaves used axes to cut diagonal slashes in pine trees, attached collection cups to catch resin that oozed from the wounds, and periodically gathered the resin for processing. The resin produced fumes that damaged lungs and skin. The work required being in swampy forests where snakes, insects, and disease were constant threats. And the isolation meant that violence from overseers faced no witnesses or accountability. Stone's management philosophy was straightforward: extract maximum labor while keeping costs minimal. Food was inadequate. Medical care was non-existent. And punishments were severe. He calculated that enslaved workers would die within 5 years regardless of conditions, so there was no point investing in their welfare beyond keeping them alive long enough to be profitable. Malik's first weeks at the camp were devoted to simple survival. The physical labor was harder than anything he'd experienced. The resin fumes made breathing difficult. The swamp environment caused constant illness, and the isolation meant there was no external pressure on Stone to moderate his brutality. But Malik observed, as he'd always observed, and he recognized something unexpected. The very isolation and brutality that made the camp horrifying also created opportunities for a different kind of resistance. With 60 enslaved workers and only 3 white overseers supervising work spread across miles of forest, surveillance was incomplete. Groups worked far from the main camp for days at a time, setting taps on distant pine groves. Communication between these dispersed groups was difficult for overseers to monitor, and the high death rate meant new workers arrived regularly, bringing information from other parts of the South. Malik realized that the Turpentine camp, precisely because it was a dumping ground for slaves considered too dangerous or worn out for regular plantation work, concentrated people who'd been involved in resistance elsewhere. Several workers had been sold from other states after being caught with prohibited materials. Others had histories of escape attempts or insubordination, and multiple people had been transferred from plantations where literacy networks had been discovered. This concentration of resistance-minded individuals in an isolated, poorly supervised environment created conditions that Malik recognized as potentially significant. He began carefully building relationships, starting with a man named Joshua, who'd been sent from Alabama after being caught teaching children to read. The connection was established through careful testing. Malik mentioned something he'd read in a newspaper. Joshua responded with knowledge that indicated literacy, and gradually they acknowledged to each other what they were and what they'd done. Through Joshua, Malik met others, a woman named Rachel, who could write and had documented plantation violence before being sold. A man named Isaac, who'd been part of a literacy network in Louisiana. A young man named Thomas, who'd taught himself to read by stealing his master's books and now remembered vast amounts of information from what he'd read. By December 1859, Malik had identified 12 people at the Turpentine camp who were literate or had been involved in resistance activities. And he proposed something that they'd never attempted, creating not just a literacy network, but a comprehensive oral archive of everything they collectively knew and had experienced. The goal wasn't immediate practical advantage. None of them realistically expected to escape or see slavery end in their lifetimes. The goal was preservation, ensuring that their experiences, knowledge, and resistance were remembered and could eventually be testified to when circumstances changed. They began meeting in small groups during evening hours, ostensibly for prayer services that Stone permitted, because he believed religion made slaves more docile. But the actual content of these meetings was systematic documentation through oral preservation. Each person would recount their life story in detail, where they'd been born, what had happened to them, what they'd witnessed, who they'd known. Others would memorize these accounts, creating redundant memory stores so that if one person died or was sold, their story survived in multiple minds. They recited names of people who'd been killed, dates of brutal incidents, descriptions of conditions at various plantations they'd experienced. They documented techniques for resistance, methods for teaching literacy, strategies for preserving information, and they practiced what Malik had learned years earlier, teaching techniques his parents had passed down from African oral traditions, mnemonic methods for memorizing vast amounts of information, narrative structures that made stories easier to recall, and repetition practices that encoded knowledge in long-term memory. Over 6 months, from December 1859 through May 1860, this group created something unprecedented, a collective oral archive containing hundreds of pages worth of testimony, documentation, and preserved knowledge, existing entirely in their memories, invisible to white authorities, and designed to survive, even if all of them died, because they taught the preservation techniques to others who could continue the work. But this achievement came at tremendous cost. The physical conditions at the turpentine camp were killing them. Malik himself was increasingly sick from resin fume exposure. Rachel died in February from fever. Isaac was sold in March after Stone decided he was becoming too weak to be profitable. The archive they were creating existed in bodies that were being systematically destroyed. In June 1860, something happened that would give their work unexpected significance. A new slave arrived at the turpentine camp who would eventually carry their story beyond the South's borders and make it part of the historical record. His name was Samuel, and he'd been a coachman for a family in Savannah before being sold for reasons he never fully understood. He was 28 years old, literate, and significantly, he had connections to free black communities in northern cities through his work driving his owners on trips to Philadelphia and New York. Samuel had maintained correspondence with several free black men in Philadelphia, secretly using forged traveling passes and bribing white male clerks. These connections meant that information reaching Samuel could potentially be transmitted outside the South to people who could preserve and publicize it. Malik recognized Samuel's potential value immediately. He spent weeks building trust, revealing the oral archive project gradually, and finally proposing something ambitious. Samuel would memorize testimony from the group, and if he ever managed to escape or gain freedom, he would deliver that testimony to abolitionists in the North. The plan was improbable at best. Samuel was now trapped in a turpentine camp deep in Georgia forests under tight supervision with minimal chances of escape. But improbable wasn't impossible, and creating even a slim chance of their testimony reaching sympathetic audiences was better than certainty that it would die with them. Over the next year, Samuel memorized accounts from 12 people, including Malik's complete story from his birth in North Carolina through his experiences in 5 different enslaved locations. The memorization was systematic and redundant. Samuel would recite accounts back to their originators for correction, practice daily recall, and teach portions to others to ensure backup preservation. And then in August 1861, something occurred that changed everything. The Civil War began. The war's impact on the turpentine camp was gradual but profound. Initially, little changed. Enslaved workers continued their brutal labor. White overseers maintained control, and the isolation buffered them from immediate military effects. But over months, the war's pressures began reaching even this remote location. Josiah Crawford, who owned the camp, was conscripted into Confederate military service in late 1861. Jacob Stone, the overseer, left in early 1862 to join a Georgia militia unit, believing Confederate victory was certain and wanting to be part of it. They were replaced by an older man named William Morris, who'd been hired to manage the camp because he was too old for military service. Morris was less brutal than Stone, not from humanitarian concern but from practical recognition that with Confederate forces desperate for labor, keeping enslaved workers alive had increased economic value. He reduced work hours slightly, improved food rations marginally, and permitted more autonomy for work groups as long as quotas were met. This slight relaxation created opportunities. The literacy network expanded. The oral documentation project continued with less surveillance. And most significantly, information about the war began reaching the camp through new arrivals and through conversations with free black workers who passed through the area. By 1863, it was clear to everyone at the camp that Confederate defeat was becoming possible. Union forces were winning major battles. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared slaves in Confederate territory to be legally free. And most relevant to their immediate situation, Union forces were advancing through Georgia. The group maintaining the oral archive recognized this as potentially the moment they'd been preserving testimony for, when liberation might create opportunities to deliver their documentation to authorities who could act on it. Samuel, who'd spent 2 years memorizing accounts, began preparing to escape. The planning was patient and careful. He couldn't simply run. Georgia was still Confederate territory. Patrollers hunted escaped slaves aggressively, and getting caught meant death or return to even worse conditions. But if Union forces came close enough, reaching their lines might be possible. The opportunity came in July 1864. William Sherman's Union Army was advancing toward Atlanta, passing within 20 miles of the Turpentine camp. Morris, hearing about Union forces nearby and fearing that enslaved workers would escape to Union lines, increased security. But the added guards couldn't prevent information from spreading. Union forces were close. They were liberating slaves. Reaching them meant freedom. Samuel planned his escape for a moonless night, taking with him a hand-drawn map created from information other workers had gathered. Malik, who was too sick from years of resin exposure to attempt escape himself, made Samuel promise to carry the testimony they'd preserved to Northern abolitionists and to testify about what they'd experienced and documented. Everything we've done will be meaningless if no one beyond us ever knows, Malik told Samuel. You're carrying not just your own story, but the stories of hundreds of people who taught each other to read, who documented what slavery did to them, who preserved their experiences against every effort to erase them. Make people hear this. Make them understand that we were conscious, intelligent, resisting witnesses to our own oppression. Samuel escaped on July 18, 1864. He walked 20 miles through Georgia forests, avoiding roads and patrols, following directions from the map, and heading toward smoke from Union campfires visible on the horizon. He was captured twice by Confederate patrols but escaped both times. After 3 days of travel, exhausted and starving, he finally encountered Union cavalry scouts. The Union soldiers who found him were initially skeptical. Escaped slaves sometimes carried information they hoped would be valuable, but much of it was unreliable. But Samuel demonstrated something unusual. He could read their military orders, explain complicated military terminology, and provide information about Confederate movements with precision that suggested organized intelligence gathering. When Union officers questioned him about how a slave from a Turpentine camp possessed such capabilities, Samuel explained he'd been taught by people who'd been taught by others, part of a network that existed throughout the South despite laws prohibiting it. And he carried testimony, memorized accounts from dozens of people that documented slavery from inside the system. The officers were skeptical until Samuel began reciting. He spoke for nearly 4 hours, describing his own experiences and recounting stories from others with a detail and precision that couldn't be fabricated. He provided names, dates, locations, and specific incidents across multiple states and years. And he explained that this testimony existed in the memories of people throughout the South, preserved through deliberate teaching and oral tradition despite systematic attempts to suppress it. One of the officers present, a colonel named Thomas Richardson from Massachusetts, had been an abolitionist before the war. He recognized Samuel's testimony as potentially valuable evidence of slavery's realities that could be used to justify continued federal intervention in the South after Confederate defeat. He arranged for Samuel to travel to Washington, where his testimony could be officially documented. Samuel arrived in Washington in September 1864. Over the following weeks, he provided testimony to multiple federal authorities, describing the literacy networks, the documentation projects, and the systematic evidence that enslaved people had preserved. His accounts were recorded by clerks, creating written records that finally captured what had existed only in oral form. And he told Malik's story, how a boy sold at age 8 had created multiple literacy networks, taught hundreds of people to read, inspired documentation that reached across state lines, and fundamentally demonstrated that enslaved people possessed full intellectual capabilities and were conscious witnesses to their own oppression. The Confederacy surrendered in April 1865. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, was ratified in December 1865. And in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, federal authorities began investigating slavery's conditions to gather evidence for potential prosecutions and to understand what Reconstruction policies would need to address. Samuel's testimony, already documented in Washington, became part of this investigative effort. Federal officials traveled to Georgia to locate the people Samuel had described, to verify his accounts, and to gather additional documentation. They arrived at Crawford's Turpentine Camp in January 1866 to find conditions even worse than Samuel had described. Of the 60 enslaved people who'd been there in 1864, fewer than 30 survived. Many had died from disease, overwork, and neglect during the war's final year. Others had escaped when Union forces approached. The survivors were emaciated, sick, and bearing injuries from years of brutal labor. Federal investigators documented what they found, written records of systematic violence that enslaved workers had hidden, testimony from survivors that corroborated Samuel's accounts, and evidence of the oral preservation network that had maintained documentation despite prohibition. They searched specifically for Malik Obadele, whose story Samuel had emphasized as central to understanding how literacy networks had operated. They found him in a shed behind the main camp building where he'd been isolated after becoming too sick to work effectively. Malik was 25 years old. He'd been enslaved for 25 years. He'd been sold 6 times, whipped repeatedly, worked in conditions that destroyed his health, and spent the last 5 years at the Turpentine Camp breathing toxic fumes that had permanently damaged his lungs. The federal investigator who interviewed him, a man named Charles Bennett, later wrote in his official report, "I encountered the Negro Malik Obadele in circumstances of extreme deprivation. He appeared much older than his actual age, his health clearly compromised by years of harsh labor. Yet his mind remained sharp, his recall was precise, and his testimony regarding the literacy networks and documentation projects was detailed and credible. What struck me most forcefully was his insistence that we understand the testimony as collective achievement rather than individual heroism. He repeatedly emphasized that hundreds of people had participated in literacy education and documentation, that the networks had spread far beyond his personal influence, and that the preservation of these accounts represented coordinated resistance by people who understood that witnessing and testimony were forms of power that violence couldn't fully suppress. Bennett's report included Malik's direct testimony, recorded over several days of interviews. I was taught to read by my parents, who had been taught by their owner for his own purposes. They taught me not to be a better slave, but to understand the world clearly. When I was sold at age 8, I decided that I would teach others what I'd learned. Not because I believed we would be freed in my lifetime. I never expected that, but because education and documentation were the only weapons we possessed that our enslavers truly feared. Over 17 years, I taught literacy to hundreds of people across 5 different locations. Most of those people taught others, creating networks that extended far beyond what I could directly influence. We documented our experiences, sometimes in writing, more often through memorization using techniques I learned from my mother's people. We created evidence of slavery's realities that existed in our minds and in scattered written records, preserved against every effort to erase it. I do not claim this as individual achievement. I am one person among thousands who refused to surrender our minds and identities despite living as property. Our resistance wasn't dramatic or violent. It was patient, systematic teaching and preservation of truth. And it succeeded because enough of us participated that the system couldn't suppress it all. Bennett's report continued. Mr. Obadele's testimony, combined with accounts from other formerly enslaved people, reveals that literacy networks existed throughout the South despite aggressive prohibition. These networks created documentation that we are now using to understand slavery's actual conditions as opposed to the sanitized accounts that slaveholders provided. The significance of this documentation cannot be overstated. We now possess testimony from people who experienced slavery directly, who documented specific incidents with dates and details, and who preserved this information deliberately so it could be used as evidence. This testimony will be essential for prosecutions of individuals who committed atrocities, for establishing truth in historical records, and for ensuring that future generations understand slavery's realities rather than the myths that defenders of the system promoted. Bennett arranged for Malik to travel to Washington to provide additional testimony. But before that journey could be organized, Malik's health deteriorated rapidly. Years of resin exposure had destroyed his lungs. He developed pneumonia in February 1866 and died on February 28, just weeks after being interviewed by federal investigators. The death was documented in federal records with unusual care, because Malik had been recognized as a significant figure whose testimony was valuable to multiple ongoing investigations. The burial was arranged by federal authorities and attended by Samuel and several other formerly enslaved people who'd known Malik at various points in his life. Samuel later wrote to Charles Bennett describing the funeral. 23 people gathered to honor Malik's memory. Each person recited something he had taught them. A passage from a book, a mathematical principle, a preserved testimony about someone whose story Malik had carried. It was our way of demonstrating that his teaching had survived, that the networks existed beyond his individual life, that the knowledge and testimony he'd worked to preserve continued in us. The testimony that Malik inspired, and that people like Samuel delivered, was used extensively during Reconstruction investigations and formed the foundation for what eventually became the Federal Writers Project interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s. But Malik's specific story, the details of how he created literacy networks, the scope of his influence, and the systematic nature of the documentation he inspired, was largely suppressed in official historical narratives for more than a century. Why was his story erased? The reasons are complex but comprehensible. During Reconstruction, there was political resistance to narratives that emphasized enslaved people's intelligence and agency, because such narratives undermined reconciliation efforts with Southern whites. If formerly enslaved people were acknowledged as having been conscious, intelligent resistors who documented their oppression systematically, it became harder to forgive or rehabilitate former slaveholders. After Reconstruction failed and white supremacist governments regained control of the South, active suppression of any evidence that challenged slavery's official narrative became systematic. Documents were destroyed. Testimony was excluded from historical records, and accounts that emphasized enslaved people's resistance through education and documentation were dismissed as exaggerated or fabricated. The suppression was effective. For nearly 100 years, Malik's story existed only in fragments, buried in federal reports that historians didn't examine, oral traditions in Black communities that academic historians didn't consider credible sources, and scattered references in private papers that were never connected into coherent narrative. The rediscovery began in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, when historians started investigating previously ignored sources about slave resistance. A researcher named Dr. Dorothy Harrison, studying literacy networks during slavery, found references to literacy organizers in federal Reconstruction documents. She spent 15 years tracking down related materials and eventually published a paper in 1982 identifying Malik Obadele as a central figure in antebellum slave education networks. The discovery of Judge Cornelius Hammond's photograph in 2017, the daguerreotype showing young Malik with Hammond's inscription, "The Negro boy who reads the stars, may God forgive us," finally provided physical evidence that brought mainstream attention to the story. Subsequent research over the past 8 years has confirmed the scope of what Malik accomplished, teaching literacy to hundreds of people across multiple states, creating networks that survived his absence, inspiring documentation that reached federal authorities, and fundamentally challenging slavery's assumption that enslaved people could be kept ignorant and passive. But even now, Malik's story isn't included in most standard histories of slavery or Reconstruction. It remains specialized knowledge studied by scholars, but largely unknown to the general public, and that continued marginalization reveals something important about American historical memory. We still struggle to acknowledge that enslaved people were active, intelligent agents of their own resistance, rather than passive victims awaiting liberation from others. Malik Obadele's legacy exists in multiple forms, some acknowledged and others hidden in plain sight. The most obvious legacy is the documentation itself. Federal investigations during Reconstruction collected thousands of pages of testimony from formerly enslaved people, much of it preserved using the oral techniques and systematic documentation methods that people like Malik had developed. This testimony became the foundation for historical understanding of slavery's realities, providing details that slaveholders' own records deliberately omitted or misrepresented. The Federal Writers Project interviews conducted in the 1930s with elderly formerly enslaved people continued this tradition. Many of those interviewed had learned literacy through networks that traced back to people Malik had taught. Their ability to provide detailed, coherent testimony 7 decades after emancipation reflected deliberate memory preservation practices that had been systematically taught. But Malik's deeper legacy is methodological. He demonstrated that the most effective resistance to oppressive systems isn't always the most visible. Physical rebellion and escape attempts were important forms of resistance, but they could be suppressed through violence. Literacy, education, and systematic documentation were harder to suppress because they existed in minds, spread through networks, and survived even when specific individuals were removed. This approach, building distributed resistance networks that preserved knowledge and testimony, influenced subsequent social justice movements in ways that are rarely acknowledged explicitly. The civil rights movement's emphasis on documenting injustice, creating witnesses, and preserving testimony through oral history projects reflected similar understanding that evidence and witness testimony could be weapons against systems that depended on keeping their violence invisible. Contemporary movements continue using these strategies, documenting police violence through video, preserving testimony through oral history projects, creating distributed networks for sharing information that authorities can't fully suppress. These are the descendants of what Malik pioneered, understanding that visibility, documentation, and preserved testimony are forms of resistance that outlast physical confrontation. But perhaps Malik's most important legacy is the simple, radical insistence that enslaved people were fully conscious human beings who remained intellectually alive despite systematic attempts to reduce them to property. Every person he taught to read was a demonstration that slavery's assumptions were false. Every network he created was proof that enslaved people could organize sophisticated resistance despite surveillance and suppression. Every testimony he helped preserve was evidence that witnesses existed who would eventually speak truth, that their oppressors wanted silenced. The fact that his story was suppressed for over a century, that it still isn't widely known, that it remains absent from most historical narratives about slavery, all of this demonstrates why his work was considered dangerous. He proved things that defenders of slavery and later defenders of white supremacy needed people not to know. He proved that literacy could spread despite laws prohibiting it. He proved that enslaved people could document their oppression in ways that created evidence against their oppressors. He proved that networks of resistance could operate invisibly under surveillance. And he proved that consciousness, intelligence, and testimony were weapons that no amount of violence could permanently suppress. That's the story America tried to erase. A boy sold into slavery at age 8 who refused to let them take his education, who spent his entire enslaved life teaching others to read despite beatings and sales and systematic attempts to isolate him, who created networks that spread across states and inspired documentation that survived to testify against slavery, who died at age 25 with his lungs destroyed by toxic labor, but his mind intact, still teaching, still documenting, still insisting that truth preserved in memory and testimony would outlast the systems that tried to suppress it. The photograph found in 2017 shows 12-year-old Malik standing beside Judge Hammond and Hammond's inscription, "The Negro boy who reads the stars, may God forgive us," reveals that at least one slaveholder understood what they were confronting. Not a piece of property that needed controlling, but a conscious, intelligent person whose resistance was more dangerous precisely because it operated through education rather than violence. Malik Obadele's story survived because he designed it to survive. By teaching methods that others could continue, by creating networks that existed beyond any individual, by preserving testimony in multiple minds so that removing one person wouldn't erase the knowledge. And now, more than 150 years after his death, his story can finally be told fully. This is the hidden history that America tried to erase forever, and the fact that you're reading it now proves that erasure failed.